because I was doing this thing today. I dug out I've got a cap that says full steam ahead. And so we're going full steam ahead. And what it is it's got the Purdue logo on there because of Purdue University Boilermakers. And it's the only university in the world that calls themselves Boilermakers. But anyway, that just threw that in to waste some time, I guess. Now I'm trying to change slides. I'm pushing my down arrow key and getting nowhere.
Do the right arrow key.
Yeah, I'm pushing that too.
Just try enter.
When we played with this a few weeks ago, when I pushed the right arrow key, it worked. Oh, well. That right arrow key's it, right? There we go. All right, this tells you a little bit about my drawing on the very first slide. And it is of the C&O. It's a H62662. And it is one of those articulated locomotives. And I used to think it was called a mallet, but it's not. It's a melee, because the guy that came up with this idea in the first place way back in the late 1800s was a guy from Switzerland who was in the French-speaking part. So M-A-L-L-E-T is pronounced melee in French, I guess. And it's restored and now running on the Western Maryland Scenic. It was the last steam locomotive built commercially in November of 1949. It's 98 feet, 8¼ inches long. And Bachmann has sold an H4. I'm going to try to throw in as many models as I can as we go through this thing, keep modeling involved. Bachmann sold an H4 model, which is basically about the same thing, but it was an older version. And here's a picture actually in operation. That one up at the very top is of the Bachmann model. My next 3 slides are going to list the wheel configurations or the wheel alignments, arrangements that are pretty much standard. I think it was named after a guy named White that came up with this idea of these wheel arrangements. And in order to present this little mini clinic that we're going through now, I was trying to think of what in the world do I know about steam locomotives. And so I decided to go back and look at all the ones that I've ridden behind in excursions. So the photos that you'll see on this thing is going to be basically photographs that I took myself of steam locomotives that I've ridden behind on most of them. And there are a couple of them in here I have not, and I'll let you know when that's the case. But we go down and just listen some of the ideas. You'll notice that some of the ones at the top, the trailing truck is a 0, which means that there's no wheels back there. And then we get into some, like the Mikado, which is a 2A2, and the Santa Fe, which is a 210-2, so forth and so on. I've got 3 different slides here of these things. And in the last lantern, if you noticed on page 2, I put a more detailed list of the daggone wheel arrangements. But you get the thing like a 284 is a Berkshire, but some of the railroads, and it was fairly common that a railroad would call their steam locomotive something else. And the C&O 284s were called Kanawas, and that's the way I pronounce it, but that's not quite right either. Does anybody know the correct pronunciation on that? But the Kentucky Steam Heritage 2716 in Ravenna is one of those. And the 611, which is also the 611 284s were built in North America. And then we go into some more here, and we get some of the Malays up on the top and the articulated. And the Allegheny was a C&O locomotive that was a 2666. And you get a Yellowstone, which is a 2884, and so forth and so on down the way. And one of the most popular locomotives of all that was built over the years was a Pacific, which is a 462. It was used on an awful lot of the railroad's passenger trains. And it was called a Pacific because the first railroad to use that 462 was the Missouri Pacific. And you'll find that some of these names that were picked up were from things like that. And then we get in, and then a couple of repeats up at the top for the way that my slideshow worked. And then we get down with the Hudson, which is a New York Central passenger locomotive, which is a 464. And the good old Northerns, which there were a lot of them were built, which were 484s. And then your Challenger, which is a Union Pacific 4664. Now, interesting thing about all of this is that about in 1925 on, they started calling steam locomotives that they were building super power steam locomotives. And part of it had to do to get more power out of it was to enlarge the firebox. And in order to do that, they put four-wheel trucks under them. So in a lot of cases, your locomotives that have got a four-wheel rear truck is because the firebox was enlarged and it took a larger truck in order to put under it. And the note at the bottom that the New York Central called their 484s Niagaras, and their 482s were called Mohawks, which is, well, again, a difference in the name changes. The number of Pacifics that were built over the years, from what I found in a book, was a little over 1,000 of them. Anyway, here's a picture of our local steam locomotive in Lexington, good old R.J. Corman 210-2, which probably most of you know a lot about good old Corman's 210-2. It was run in excursions or on runs a few times. I remember one of its first trips was out of Louisville pulling a sand train, I think, that went through Frankfurt. It has not been run in a number of years, and since R.J. Corman himself died a number of years ago, I don't think it's been moved from the side of the shop building down there. Anyway, my phone's ringing, so don't pay any attention to that. Matt, one of his employees, was actually sent to China and worked with the Chinese to get that thing ready to be sent over here. And here's a picture that I took once that it was on display in good old Midway. Thomas and I got out some portable generator and some spotlights and went over there because they stored it behind Midway College overnight so that it would be on display at the Midway in the town on Saturday and Sunday both. And I took this picture of the front end after we had lit it up, and we did get permission from R.J. Corman to go over and do that. So then I get into some of the others that I've been behind. This is a picture that I took in 2015 of a 260 at Strasbourg that we rode an excursion on. And here's the good old rebuilt, brand new. I mean, it's a brand new locomotive basically, but it's a 440, which is called an American. And Bachmann Trains has 5 versions of Americans. I rode that behind that up in Ohio a number of years ago. Then out in the great state of Washington, I was once on an excursion behind a 282T, which T is for tank. As you can see, the water tank is built around the outside of the locomotive, and that was on the Mount Rainier Scenic Railroad. I don't have any, I mean, I could not find any models that, I don't believe any modeling companies have ever built a model of a tank locomotive. If I'm wrong on that, let me know. Then there's this good old 282 Mikado that is the narrow gauge that we saw a couple of months ago in our clinic on the Durango and Silverton, which when we went out to Durango that one time, instead of taking the train to Silverton and back, we actually took a bus tour, which I would recommend if you ever go out there, from Durango to Silverton, and then you get on the train and ride it back. So you're only on the train one way. That way you get to Silverton before the train gets there, and you can get into some of the restaurants and get a lunch before the big crowd shows up that gets off the excursion. Another good old Mikado is the 282-4501, which is down now at the Tennessee Valley Railway Museum, and Bachmann has 282 models. One of them for the nickel plate is pictured down there on the bottom. This was a picture I took on a run by on a excursion I took from Chattanooga down into Georgia and back. I think Larry and Thomas and I have all ridden. No, was it 45? Hey, Larry, are you on?
Yes.
Was it 4501 that we rode from Knoxville down to Chattanooga that one time when it, or was that the 630?
Might have been the.
You remember that trip where it overheated its bearings and they had to send
bearings
a out of Chattanooga to rescue us and get us to Chattanooga?
Yeah, we had to stop, get to have the diesel come pick us up. I think that was 4501. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, then I threw a picture. Wait a minute, I hit my button. Of Frank Stevenson's 282 Mikado. I took this a few weeks ago when we had a tour over at his house. And that's LNN 185, or no, it's 18556 is actually the number on the locomotive. If for those of you that made it to Frank's tour, you probably noticed that he's got a collection of 40 some odd steam locomotive models, which is the most of anybody that I know of in our club having steam locomotives. Here's a good old picture of a 484 Northern, which is the Milwaukee 261, which is up in Minneapolis. We've ridden behind it 2 or 3 times. This was on a excursion going over in the western part of Minnesota and back. And then one of our greatest trips, I think, was on a 484 Northern, which was, this picture was taken in, my mind just went blank on the city in Washington. Anyway, we rode it from there over to Portland. And that was that year that they actually had steam locomotives up in Michigan at the OShea, and they had a whole bunch of steam locomotives. And it was the one time that 484 Northern Southern Pacific 4449 actually made it east of the Mississippi and back. But they had excursions, and it took like 4 or 5 days to get back to Portland. And we flew out to Spokane. There I go. Flew out to Spokane and rode it for a day's trip from there to Portland. And on the bottom, Mikado has got a Union Pacific 484 model that they've sold in years past. And I believe the woman in the red coat standing there by the locomotive is my wife. Anyway, then good old 284 Berkshires, the Fort Wayne Historical Society has an NKP 765, which is operational. And we've ridden on it across Indiana and on Ohio a couple of times and so forth. Different excursions over the years with that one. And Bachmann also makes a model of that, which you see down there, which is the one that I have on Tom Bensberg's layout from years ago. L&N, of course, had 284s also, but they were called Big Emmas, and they were not exactly the same locomotive. They were, I think, about 6 inches longer than the Berkshires and the name Berkshire came from the fact that the first time that it was run was in the Berkshire Mountains of Massachusetts. I have converted that picture there of my nickel plate over to the Chesapeake and Ohio, which you may have seen because when a few years back before the pandemic, we set up a T-track layout there at Ravenna, and I was actually running it as a Chesapeake and Ohio then. Would change the number on it. And then here's another picture of that NKP 765 that I took in Indiana when, of course, good old steam locomotives, they had to stop every so many hours, you know, to do some maintenance work. And another interesting trip that we took once in Wisconsin and up into Minneapolis was behind Canadian Pacific's 464 Hudson. And I found Lionel has a model of the 464, which you see down there. And this prototype picture was taken by me in Minneapolis. And Canadian Pacific and the Kansas City Southern are now trying to get merged. And if our ST Surface Transportation Board in Washington approves that merger, they plan on running that locomotive with an excursion train out of Calgary, Canada, all the way into Mexico. So we'll maybe see that someday. The connection between the Canadian Pacific and the Kansas City Southern is in Kansas City, Missouri. And then in good old Conway Scenic up in, is it New Hampshire or Vermont? I don't remember which state I was in, but there's a good old 060 that they run steam excursions with. And Bachmann has a model of it down there, which you can see is my model that I have decaled for the Monon, because the last steam locomotive that the Monon Railroad had that still was in operation and switching was a 060. And then I took a picture of one time when I was over at Bob Belt's house of his consolidation, which is a 280 model. And then here's another consolidation that we've ridden on an excursion behind with the Western Maryland Scenic, which goes up to Frostburg, Maryland. And they have a turntable there. Now, they're now running that big old 2662 that was in the first slide, and the second slide, and the third. And I've kind of wondered on that turntable, is that turntable long enough for that articulated locomotive or not? But somehow they're running excursions at Frostburg and back. Anybody have any idea on whether that articulated fits on that turntable?
It's my understanding that the locomotive, the 1309 will fit on the turntable, but the track going up to it is not suitable for that articulated locomotive. So they run it in reverse.
They run it in reverse to go back?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's correct. I was up there a couple of weeks ago and saw it, and the engine crew indicated that it is on their list of things to do to realign the track to the turntable, but they've got other priorities at the moment, so they do run reverse with a diesel on the other end.
Will their 2662 actually fit on that turntable if they can get it there?
It'll fit, but barely.
Barely, okay. So our 98 feet or whatever, the total length is just about the length of that turntable.
I think so.
Then I've got another picture of a 280 consolidation, which is on Pat Gerstel's S-scale narrow gauge layout when he had it over here that we toured in the past, which was one of our tours in our convention in 2015. Pat doesn't live there anymore, and I have no idea what the status is of his layout because he tore it apart and when he left the house that he used to live in. And then got a picture of Tennessee Valley's Southern 630, which is a consolidation, which I took this picture down in the R.J. Corman yard because Larry and Bruce and Thomas and I know at least the four of us rode an excursion out of Lexington down into Tennessee and back a number of years ago, and they had to take it down to Corman's yard to put it on the Y in order to turn it. So I got a picture of it when it was down there. And then another trip is on a good OShea, which was at Cass. And Bachmann in the past has had a model of Shea's, which I've tried to impose on that thing down there, but That was a picture I took up at the top of the mountain where we went and had lunch, and then they took us back down again. I guess probably a lot of you have been on that Shea tour. But what do they have now? 5 or 6 Sheas? And they just recently have opened up the line where they actually run up the river, which got washed out years and years ago. They got it opened up again and tour up to, what is the Elkins?
It's up to Durban.
Oh,
And
Durban, right, okay.
I think they have 5 operable Sheas and several more on the deadline.
And then this is
They got a
picture of
climax
Shea,
up there too.
picture of Fred Plymale Shea model on his layout. And then we get into Pacifics, which, like I said, I think there were more Pacifics built than anything else. This is a picture of Atlantic Coastline 1504, which is now being restored by the U.S. Sugar Corporation, being restored in Chattanooga, Tennessee. The model that you see down there is from Broadway Limited. And that is my model, and it's been decaled by me for U.S. Sugar for the future on the Sugar Express. And I have ridden behind a 462 up in Duluth, Minnesota, which I don't have a picture of that one. But this picture of the prototype was taken in Jacksonville before it was moved to Chattanooga. And then we get into good old Big Boy, which I haven't ridden behind in an excursion on Big Boy, but we've been up to Chicago and whatever when it was on tour, and the picture of the cab up there in the top right-hand corner basically has the number of the locomotive and has some other information. And I think the 68 on there is somebody correct me if I'm wrong on that, 68-inch drivers. Anyway,
Yeah, and then the numbers after that are the cylinders, bore and stroke.
the Broadway Limited is now coming out with a Big Boy model with DCC and Paragon 4 sound, as they call it. They claim, now this picture here is of an N scale, and they claim on N scale that they can run it as a down to maybe like 11-inch radius curve or something like that. But I talked to Frank about that when I was over there at the tour, and he thinks that's going to be stretching it a little bit to get that thing around that narrow of a curve. But so anyway, when you look at the specs on the Broadway Limited Big Boys, they'll tell you how sharp of a curve that you can run it on. If it really does that well or not, we don't know. But anyway, that's my, oh, one other comment. When I said originally we were talking about four-wheel trucks underneath the firebox, because the fireboxes were much improved and larger starting in about 1925 and so forth. And a lot of these models, or a lot of these good old wheel arrangements that you see when they have a four-wheel truck on the back, it's because they were needed for the firebox size. Some of the older ones prior to 1925, like the 282 Mikados, only had 2 wheels on the rear end. Anybody have any? I mean, that's it for me, unless you got some questions or some corrections as to something I said that was wrong.